Can you pretend to be my blind date? A single mom asked a sad millionaire CEO. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't smile too much. She just stood there next to his table, heart racing, and said something she'd never planned to say. Can you pretend to be my blind date? I'll pay for dinner. The words hung in the air longer than she expected. Julian Rowe looked up slowly, fork still in his hand, food untouched, eyes tired in a way money doesn't fix. For a second, it felt like the whole restaurant went quiet. Marissa Cole instantly regretted it, not because it was rude, but because it was honest. Too honest for a stranger, too vulnerable for a public place. If you believe in compassion and the quiet strength of ordinary people, take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us how one small act can change everything. He didn't answer right away. No joke, no polite excuse, just a long pause that made her chest tighten. She was already preparing to apologize and walk away. She thought about her phone, about the message she'd just read, about the empty chair across from her table, about how lonely a room can feel even when it's full, and how walking away would feel easier than staying. Julian finally exhaled, a slow breath, like he'd been holding it all day. He looked at the empty chair across from him, then back at her face, like he was deciding something much bigger than dinner. Sit, he said quietly, not commanding, not flirty, just human. And somehow, that one word changed everything. She sat down before she lost the nerve, didn't know his last name, didn't know his life, didn't know this moment would echo far beyond this night, and neither did he. But somewhere between that chair moving and that first shared silence, something invisible had already started. Not romance, not business, something softer. Something that would ask both of them to choose differently than they ever had before. Marissa Cole sat down slowly, still half expecting him to change his mind and ask her to leave. Her hands felt warmer than usual, and she wrapped them around the glass of water like it could steady her. She noticed small things right away, like how carefully he placed his fork down, how his jacket looked expensive but worn, and how his eyes kept drifting to the window instead of her face. This wasn't a man trying to impress anyone. This was someone trying to disappear for an hour. Julian Rowe wasn't supposed to be there that night. He'd picked the restaurant because it was quiet, predictable, and far enough from the office to avoid familiar faces. Dinner alone had become routine, something he no longer explained or apologized for. But the woman sitting across from him had disrupted that rhythm in a way he didn't expect. Not loudly, not dramatically, just by being real in a place where everything felt rehearsed. She broke the silence first, not with a joke, but with a sigh that slipped out before she could stop it. She admitted her blind date wasn't coming, said it plainly, without bitterness or blame. Julian nodded, not asking for details, not offering sympathy either. He recognized that tone too well. It was the sound of someone who had already accepted disappointment long before it arrived. Marissa talked because quiet made her nervous, and because talking had always been how she survived uncomfortable rooms. She mentioned her son briefly, the way people do when it's the center of their life but not the point of the conversation. She explained she ran a small design studio, nothing flashy, mostly local businesses that trusted her because she listened. She didn't pitch herself. She just explained her world the way it was. Julian listened without interrupting, without glancing at his phone, without pretending interest. That alone felt strange to her. Most people waited for their turn to speak, to sell themselves, to one-up the story. He didn't. He asked one or two questions, simple ones, but they landed deeper than expected. Questions about choice, about values, about what she refused to compromise on even when money was tight. She noticed he never talked about himself in the same way. When she asked what he did, he answered vaguely, saying he worked in business and traveled more than he liked. No titles, no numbers, no hints of status. There was a careful boundary in his words, like someone used to being misunderstood once the full picture came out. Marissa didn't push. She'd learned that silence could also be respectful. As the conversation unfolded, something softened between them. Not attraction, not romance, but relief. Relief from pretending, from explaining, from being impressive. Two people sharing a table without trying to fix each other. Outside, the city moved on like nothing special was happening, unaware that both of them were quietly breathing easier than they had all day. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both felt it. This wasn't just about filling an empty chair or avoiding a lonely dinner. There was a reason this moment felt heavier than it should, a reason it lingered in the air longer than polite conversation usually does, and whatever that reason was, it hadn't revealed itself yet. The conversation drifted into a quieter place, the kind that doesn't announce itself but slowly settles between two people who feel safe enough to pause. Marissa leaned back slightly, her shoulders dropping for the first time that night, and admitted she worked more hours than she should, not because she loved being busy, but because stability had never been guaranteed for her. She said mistakes felt expensive when someone else depended on you. She talked about turning down contracts that didn't feel right, even when the money would have helped. Clients who wanted shortcuts, messaging that didn't sit well with her, promises she knew couldn't be kept. She didn't frame it as virtue or sacrifice, just as something she couldn't bring herself to do. Her voice stayed calm, but there was weight underneath it, the kind that comes from learning lessons the hard way. Julian listened closely, his expression changing in small, almost unnoticeable ways. When she finished, he didn't respond with praise or encouragement. Instead, he asked a question that felt too precise to be casual. He asked if she'd ever lost something important by choosing her values over opportunity, not hypothetically, not philosophically, but personally. The question caught her off guard. Marissa hesitated, fingers tightening around her glass as she considered how much honesty the moment could hold. She nodded slowly and said yes, more than once. She mentioned a partnership that fell apart, a chance that never came back, and nights where she wondered if doing the right thing had been a mistake. She didn't dramatize it. She just told the truth. Julian's gaze stayed steady, not curious in the way people get when they want a story, but focused in a way that suggested recognition. He didn't rush to reassure her. He didn't say everything happens for a reason. He simply said he understood more than she might think. It was the first time he hinted at a deeper layer of himself without opening the door completely. Marissa noticed the shift immediately. Something about him felt different now, heavier, more grounded. This wasn't just a man humoring a stranger out of politeness. There was intention in the way he listened, a seriousness that didn't belong to someone passing time. She felt it in her chest before she could name it, a quiet sense that this conversation mattered. Around them, plates were cleared and glasses refilled, but neither of them paid much attention. The restaurant faded into background noise, like a scene no longer meant for them. This was no longer about a blind date gone wrong. It was about two lives briefly intersecting at a place neither of them had planned to be emotionally open. Marissa didn't realize it yet, but that single question had shifted the direction of the night. It had taken something casual and turned it into a moment that would follow them both long after the check was paid. Whatever Julian had seen in her answer, it wasn't accidental. And whatever it stirred in him was about to move far beyond this table. As the plates were cleared and the low hum of the restaurant filled the space between them, the night began to feel fragile, like it could end at any second. Marissa sensed it first, that quiet pressure that comes when something meaningful is about to slip away. She reminded herself that this was temporary, that she had asked a stranger for a favor, and he had generously said yes. Anything beyond that would be asking too much. She excused herself for a moment and stepped outside to breathe, the cool air hitting her face harder than she expected. Her phone buzzed again, another message from the man who never showed up, this time apologizing and asking to reschedule. She didn't respond. Standing there alone on the sidewalk, she felt the familiar ache of being the one who always adjusted, always understood, always moved on quietly. Inside, Julian sat still, staring at the empty chair across from him. He told himself he should leave, that this wasn't his responsibility, that he'd already done more than enough by sharing a meal, yet something kept him rooted there. He recognized the look in her eyes when she stood up, the look of someone bracing themselves for disappointment without making a scene. He'd worn that same expression more times than he cared to count. Marissa returned to the table with a polite smile, trying to act normal, trying not to let the heaviness follow her back inside. She thanked him again for sitting with her, already preparing her goodbye in her head. This was the part she knew well, the moment where connection fades and life resumes its separate paths. She told herself she'd be fine because she always was. Julian noticed the shift immediately, the way her voice tightened just slightly. the way her posture straightened like armor going back on. He realized then how alone she really was in that moment, not just tonight, but in the way she moved through the world. It wasn't dramatic loneliness. It was practical, quiet, and constant, and it stirred something uncomfortable inside him. For a brief second, both of them sat in silence, each wrestling with their own instinct to retreat. Marissa felt foolish for expecting more from a stranger. Julian felt the pull of an old habit, the one that told him to avoid emotional entanglements at all costs. The table between them suddenly felt wider, like a distance neither of them knew how to cross. This wasn't humiliation or loss playing out in public. It was something subtler and harder to name. Two people standing at the edge of vulnerability, aware that stepping forward could hurt, but stepping back would mean returning to something emptier. The choice hadn't been spoken yet, but it was already forming. Neither of them knew it then, but this was the lowest point of the night, the moment where walking away would have been the safest option. The next move, whichever one came first, would decide whether this encounter became just another forgettable evening or the beginning of something that asked them both to change. The shift happened quietly, without any dramatic announcement, the way real-life changes usually do. Julian was the one who broke the silence, not with a question, but with a statement that surprised even him. He said she didn't owe him an explanation or gratitude, and that sitting there with her hadn't felt like a favor. It felt like the first honest moment he'd had in weeks. The words landed gently, but they carried weight. Marissa looked at him carefully, trying to understand what he meant and whether she could trust it. People often said kind things when the night was ending, when nothing was expected of them afterward. But this felt different. There was no charm in his tone, no attempt to soften the truth. Just a calm admission that being there mattered to him more than he'd anticipated. He told her, slowly and without detail, that he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time, that success had complicated his life instead of simplifying it, that people often saw what they wanted to see and rarely stayed once they understood the cost of staying. He didn't mention money, titles, or achievements. He talked about isolation, about pressure, about the exhaustion of always being the steady one. Marissa listened the way she always had, with full attention and no interruptions. She recognized the pattern immediately, not because it matched her own life, but because she'd seen it in clients, friends, and family members who looked fine on the outside and were barely holding together underneath. She didn't try to fix him or offer perspective. She simply acknowledged what he was saying and let it be real. Julian hadn't expected that reaction. He was used to people either pulling away or trying to solve him like a problem. Her response did neither. It created space. In that space, he felt something loosen slightly, something he hadn't realized was constantly clenched. For the first time that night, he leaned back in his chair, not out of distance, but relief. The check arrived soon after, placed quietly between them like a reminder that the night had limits. Marissa reached for it out of habit, but Julian gently stopped her, sliding it back toward himself without making it a point of pride. He said it didn't matter who paid. What mattered was that she didn't leave feeling dismissed. The gesture wasn't romantic, it was deliberate. As they stood to leave, the atmosphere felt different than it had an hour earlier. Not lighter, but steadier. Marissa mentioned her studio again, almost as an afterthought, saying it was small but meaningful to her. Julian nodded, filing the information away without comment. They exchanged polite goodbyes, no numbers, no promises, both pretending this was where it ended. They walked out in opposite directions, each carrying more than they arrived with. Julian felt the echo of her honesty follow him into the night, stirring questions he'd avoided for years. Marissa felt a strange calm settle in, as if something unresolved had finally been acknowledged. Neither of them knew it yet, but this separation was only temporary, and the choice Julian would make next would pull them back into each other's lives in a way neither could predict. The next morning, Julian arrived at his office earlier than usual, the city still half asleep beneath a gray sky. He set his coffee down untouched and opened his laptop, telling himself he was just clearing his head before meetings began. Instead, he found his fingers typing the name Marissa had mentioned the night before, curious in a way that felt personal rather than professional. He wasn't looking for confirmation of talent, only for understanding. Marissa's studio appeared on the screen without effort, modest in design but thoughtful in tone. Julian scrolled slowly through the site, noticing how the work focused less on trends and more on clarity, less on selling and more on meaning. There were stories behind each project, small businesses treated with care and respect, and language that felt honest instead of loud. It reminded him of something he had valued once, before growth complicated everything. He leaned back in his chair and realized this wasn't about hiring a designer, at least not yet. It was about a choice he'd been avoiding, the choice to engage with people instead of managing them from a distance. Julian had spent years insulating himself emotionally, believing it was the price of leadership. Now, the memory of Marissa's steady presence made that belief feel thin and outdated. Without overthinking it, he asked his assistant to draft a simple email. No flattery, no urgency, no mention of the dinner, just an invitation to talk about potential collaboration. He read it twice before sending, making sure it respected her time and didn't assume interest. When the message left his outbox, Julian felt a quiet tension settle in, the kind that comes with stepping outside familiar boundaries. Marissa received the email later that afternoon, in between client calls and revisions. At first, she thought it might be a mistake, someone else with the same name, another coincidence that wouldn't lead anywhere. Then she saw the domain and felt her stomach tighten slightly. She reread the message, surprised by its tone, by how formal and careful it was, by how it asked instead of demanded. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat back and considered what saying yes would mean. Larger companies often came with compromises, expectations she'd learned to be wary of. But something about the invitation felt different, grounded, respectful. After a few minutes of quiet thought, she replied with a brief acceptance, keeping her own words measured and professional. The meeting was scheduled quickly, and when Marissa arrived at the building days later, she realized how much she'd underestimated the scale of his world. The lobby was expansive, polished, and intimidating in its efficiency. She took a steady breath, reminding herself that she belonged in any room she entered, even if it wasn't built for her comfort. Inside the conference room, Julian greeted her with the same calm presence she remembered from the restaurant, though now layered with authority. The team listened as she presented her ideas, fielding questions that tested both her creativity and resolve. Julian watched quietly, noticing how she stayed true to her values, even under pressure. This wasn't a battle against anyone. It was a deliberate act of standing for something, and it marked the beginning of a deeper commitment neither of them had fully named yet. In the days that followed, Julian began focusing less on outcomes and more on how his decisions affected people. Watching Marissa handle pressure without losing herself made him rethink what real strength looked like. It wasn't control or certainty, but steadiness. For Marissa, being taken seriously without being reshaped changed something fundamental. She realized she could grow without abandoning her values, and that understanding quietly shaped what came next. The call came on a Tuesday morning, right when Marissa was trying to get her son out the door with a backpack that wouldn't zip and a lunch he suddenly decided he didn't want. She balanced the phone on her shoulder, expecting another client change request. But the voice on the line was from Julian's office and sounded unusually careful. They told her the project had been approved in principle, and her work had made an impression. But the final decision would depend on one more presentation. Marissa's first reaction was relief, followed instantly by fear that she tried to hide even from herself. She asked who would be in the room and what they needed to see, and the answer felt like a weight dropping onto her shoulders. Julian would be out of state closing an acquisition, and the communications leaders wanted her to present the full strategy without him there to frame it. Marissa thanked the caller, ended the call, and stood still in her kitchen for a moment, letting the quiet hit her. At the office later, she looked at her slides and realized this wasn't just about design anymore. It was about credibility, about being taken seriously in a world that often dismissed people like her before they even spoke. She replayed every question from the first meeting, every skeptical look, every moment she had felt her confidence wobble. Then she remembered the way Julian had watched her that day, not rescuing her, not speaking for her, just trusting her to stand on her own. The night before the presentation, Marissa stayed up after her son fell asleep, revising her materials and rehearsing in a whisper so she wouldn't wake him. She kept thinking about the restaurant, about how this started with a simple, slightly desperate sentence, and how unreal it felt that it had led here. She told herself she didn't need Julian in the room, that she could do this, but she still felt the ache of being alone at the edge of something big. Then she wrote one line at the top of her notes, a reminder to stay human instead of perfect. The next morning, the conference room felt colder than she remembered, and the faces around the table were sharper, more guarded. Marissa introduced herself calmly, then began to tell the story behind the work, not as a pitch, but as a promise to communicate with honesty. She spoke about clarity, about trust, about how people could feel when a company's words didn't match its actions. She didn't perform confidence. She practiced it, one sentence at a time, refusing to rush or apologize. Halfway through, someone challenged her directly, asking why the company should trust a small studio with a public shift this important. Marissa didn't flinch. She answered plainly that trust wasn't built by size, it was built by care, and her entire business existed because she treated people like their stories mattered. She acknowledged the risk, then explained how she would protect the brand by listening closely and refusing shortcuts. The room stayed quiet, but the quiet felt different now, less skeptical and more attentive. When she finished, there was a pause that felt like it could go either way, and Marissa held her hands still so no one would see them tremble. Then the head of communications nodded slowly and said the plan felt unusually grounded and surprisingly human. Another person added that it was the first time the company's message sounded like it could actually be believed. Marissa thanked them and gathered her materials, trying not to read too much into their expressions as she walked out, but her chest felt lighter with every step. Later that afternoon, the email arrived confirming the contract. Marissa stared at the screen, letting the words sink in, and then she laughed quietly, not out of triumph, but out of disbelief that something good had actually held. She wanted to tell someone, but she didn't have a long list of people to call, so she sat with it for a moment and let herself feel proud. In another city, Julian received the same update and closed his eyes for a second, realizing he hadn't just hired a studio. He had trusted a person, and that trust had changed something in him he didn't know how to name yet. The weeks that followed the contract moved faster than Marissa expected, and success arrived without the relief she had imagined. Her studio filled with new inquiries, new expectations, and a kind of pressure that didn't leave room for celebration. She found herself working later, answering emails after midnight, and wondering if growth always came with this quiet sense of imbalance. The work was meaningful, but the pace reminded her how thin her margin for error still was. At home, her son noticed the change before she did, asking why she was always tired and why dinner happened closer to bedtime now. Marissa tried to explain without worrying him, saying this was a good thing, that sometimes life asked for more before it gave back. Still, she felt the tension of choosing between momentum and presence, between building something lasting and staying grounded in the life she was building it for. The questions followed her even when she slept. Some nights, after her son was asleep, she sat alone at the kitchen table with her laptop closed, staring at nothing in particular. The silence felt heavier than exhaustion, filled with thoughts she didn't have time to unpack during the day. She wondered if she had mistaken progress for peace, and whether success would always feel like standing on uneven ground. It wasn't regret she felt, but a longing for balance she hadn't yet learned how to claim. Julian returned from his trip carrying a different kind of weight. The acquisition had gone through smoothly, the numbers made sense, and the board was satisfied, but his attention kept drifting back to the presentation he hadn't witnessed. He reviewed the feedback carefully, reading how Marissa had handled the room on her own, how her approach had shifted the tone of internal conversations. There was pride in the outcome, but also a strange sense of distance he hadn't anticipated. He realized she hadn't reached out, not to celebrate, not to seek approval, not even to acknowledge the role he had played in opening the door. At first, he told himself that was professionalism, exactly what he had wanted. But the more he thought about it, the more he recognized something deeper. She hadn't needed him to validate the work, and that challenged a part of his identity he rarely examined. It forced him to confront how often he equated importance with indispensability. Outside forces began to surface, pulling at both of them in different ways. Julian faced questions from colleagues about future direction, about scaling quickly and pushing harder, while Marissa dealt with vendors, timelines, and clients who assumed her availability had expanded along with her success. Each of them felt the weight of expectations pressing in, reminding them that growth often invites scrutiny as much as opportunity. Neither spoke about it, but both felt stretched in ways that felt personal, not professional. One evening, Julian found himself back at the same restaurant without planning to be there, sitting at a familiar table with an untouched plate. He thought about the first night, about how simple it had felt to just listen and be listened to without strategy. The contrast between that memory and his current routine felt sharp enough to demand attention. He realized he missed not her presence alone, but the version of himself that had surfaced in that moment. Marissa, meanwhile, sat at her desk long after everyone else had left, staring at her calendar and feeling the weight of success settle unevenly. She thought about how quickly things had changed and how little space she'd given herself to process it. For a moment, she considered sending a message, then stopped, unsure of what she would even say. Gratitude felt